Hi everyone. I'm going to start with a question. What does home mean to you? Where do you feel most at home? Maybe you're thinking about the place that you live right now. Maybe you're thinking about your childhood home. Perhaps you feel at home when you're with particular people or doing particular things. Maybe you feel at home in more than one place. Now, for migrants and refugees, this idea of home is somewhat fractured, and today I'm going to be talking about how we can feel at home in a new place. It's important to also remember that home is not a place of safety and comfort for everyone. So right now, of course, hundreds of thousands of people have been fleeing their homes in search of safety and security, and many of them embarking upon dangerous journeys in order to do so. And it's also important to remember that the challenges of migration don't end because you've resettled in a new place. In many ways, it's the beginning of many more challenges. So I'm going to start with this definition of home that was offered by the humanist geographer Yi Fu Tuan. He talks about the multiple levels at which home can be experienced, and that people experience home in many different ways. He says, what is home? It is the old homestead, the old neighborhood, the hometown, or the motherland. And in many ways, this points to the different scales of home and the ways in which they can exist alongside each other. As I was saying before, for many people, home is not a safe place. And I'm going to take you back now to around 1975, when hundreds of thousands of people, in fact over 1 million people, eventually left Vietnam after 1975, when North Vietnamese forces entered Saigon and took control of the city and reunited the country. Now, for some people, this is called the American War, for others, the reunification of Vietnam. Either way, hundreds of thousands of people, particularly those who were associated with the American government, had to flee the city. One of my first participants in my research project, whose name is Son, described the horrendous conditions of this boat journey. He actually tried to escape 5 times before eventually succeeding, and each time he tried to escape before, he'd been warned that the authorities had found out about his planned trip. So when he eventually escaped, he decided to leave without his wife and youngest child. They weren't reunited until eventually he reached London. And he said, we had a lot of people in the boat. We had to throw food overboard. We had to survive on rice and sweet water. It took us a week drifting at sea. And for those who were lucky enough to be rescued, most of them had to spend weeks, months, or even years in refugee camps in Hong Kong, Malaysia, and other places. So not only had they survived that difficult journey, but they then had this kind of in-between space in which they had to adjust to a very difficult condition. In 1979, at the peak of the Southeast Asia refugee crisis, the UN held a conference, and after that conference it was agreed that these refugees would be resettled around the world, and a lot of them were resettled in the US and Australia, but in the end, between 1975 and 1988, around 22,000 Vietnamese refugees were accepted by the UK. And Son was one of those refugees, and he arrived at the age of 11 with his mother and sister and brother. As I mentioned before, the challenges of migration, particularly displacement, don't end just because you've got a house in a new city. For Vietnamese refugees arriving at that time in the 1970s and 80s, it was very difficult to find work, to find housing that was adequate for their families. And another of my participants, whose name is Vu, he described this as fear of getting lost and not being able to find our way. We had no bearings to help ground us. We weren't at home. And I think this points to the powerful sense that he expresses when your home has been basically removed from you in this incredibly traumatic way. Vietnam has undergone huge political and economic change since the post-war period. And while many of the first Vietnamese refugees had to find work in Hackney's clothing factories, and had to adapt to London's changing industries and opening their own restaurants, some of them opening nail salons. Many people now are leaving the country for very different reasons. And many of these are young people who are moving from Vietnam to study overseas. And Min is one of these people. So Min is a participant I met who came to London to begin a master's degree at King's College. And she came here partly because, well, a major factor in her decision was because her sister and brother were already studying in the city. And she saw London as a place of opportunity. She imagined it as a place of adventure, diversity, where she could experience new things. And because she had her brother and sister there, she didn't feel that sense of isolation or loneliness, that she felt excited to come to the city. And the contrast between Vu's story and Min's story is huge, and in many ways is reflected throughout the Vietnamese population in the UK. It's hugely diverse. But in this talk, I'm going to suggest that we can also find connections between these hugely diverse experiences in terms of how people can create a sense of home in a new place and the strategies that they draw upon to do this. So one of the ways that refugees and migrants often find a sense of home, if they're able to get settled in a new house, is through particular objects. And these were often very important to people. So either objects they were able to bring with them on their journey, small photographs, or particular ornaments, or items of religious worship. But something I kept seeing over and over again in people's houses were these kind of very beautiful pictures, either painted or embroidered, of Vietnamese rural villages. Beautiful landscapes and rice fields, and for many people these evoked a sense of their ancestral homeland and the place that they hoped to one day return to. But for younger people it's much more difficult to have these kinds of objects in their house because they often have very transient, unstable housing situations. So renting is often the only option for living in the capital city of London, and they move house 3 or 4 times a year sometimes, so they cannot have these collections of objects in the same way. So I thought, well, maybe aesthetic forms of homemaking aren't crucial for people. Maybe they don't need to feel that sense of home if they're here for their career or education. But it turns out that actually younger people were motivated to create a sense of home in a new place, just in different ways. So this is the story of Ngoc, who came to study in London as well. And she talks about how she brings particular things into her house, a student house in East London, to make it feel more like home. We have all the stuff we need, spices, ingredients, food. And she talks about customizing her home. So even though she couldn't make major changes to her place, she was still able to feel a sense of belonging, sense of community, making it feel more like our house now. And that was something that's been repeated again and again, the more people that I spoke to. This is a picture of a domestic shrine or altar to the female Buddha and the Buddha that was in the home of Son, the first person I spoke about who came as a refugee. And for many people, migrants around the world, spiritual or religious practices are actually crucial to maintaining a sense of home, whether that means visiting a religious institution in their new place or practicing different forms of worship at home. Now, in Vietnam, many people make offerings of prayer or food, water, other material goods to their ancestors, who are considered to exist alongside living relatives, and offer them help and support. And people often ask their ancestors for help at particular times in their life, like with exams, with life events, with business, things like that. And this was something that people felt often able to carry on in their new place, in their new location. And many people that I met did have these collections of objects that they either used to worship the Buddha or to ask for help from their ancestors. And in many ways, this form of worship also links homes in Vietnam with their homes in London. So people would actually ask the spirits to bless their family and home in Vietnam, but also to bless their current location and home. So this kind of created these stronger links across transnational space over time with their deceased relatives. But it was also constrained by the social and economic demands of living in London. Several people said they couldn't house an altar because they didn't have the space, or they didn't have the money or time to get the right items, ornaments that would be needed. But most people that I spoke to found ways to adapt, whether that's through having a smaller collection of objects, visiting local temples, or, kind of, as Ngoc said, customizing it in different ways. But ancestor worship wasn't the most important way for everyone to feel at home. So one of my youngest participants, her name is Hang, she came here to study, and she's a follower of the Vietnamese Buddhist monk Thich Nhat Hanh. And Thich Nhat Hanh is the founder of the engaged Buddhism movement, and he offers quite a radically different view of home that's not dependent on material objects or particular possessions, and in fact offers a view of home that can be found within oneself, potentially anywhere in the world. So he says your true home is in the here and now. It's not limited by time, space, or nationality. Something you can touch and live in every moment. And Hang valued this, the sense that she could create a sense of home wherever she was in the world through mindfulness, through engagement in the community. Now, so far I've talked about how people can find a sense of home in conditions of movement through particular objects and practices. But what about work? Might it be possible for work to give us a sense of home in a new place? Now, to answer this question, I'm going to talk about the stories of extraordinary women from Myanmar, formerly known as Burma. And these women left their country for different reasons, but Burma is a country that has undergone protracted periods of military rule, ethnic conflict, and is only comparatively recently undergoing transition towards democracy or political reform. And I met these women while I was volunteering at an NGO in Thailand that supports women who come from Myanmar to gain an education, either bachelor's or master's level degree, and then they go back and contribute to their communities. Now, many of these women were campaigning on particular issues already. They were interns or volunteers or working in particular organizations. And for them, I was struck by the importance that leaving home had for them to be able to gain awareness of these issues, but also to work on behalf of their communities because they couldn't do it at the time inside Myanmar. And in many ways, even in leaving home, they were challenging traditional ideas of what a woman should be doing. You know, normally, as Nozin says here, women were normally living in the house and working in the house. And it wasn't until she came to Thailand and learned about human rights and women's rights, she found a different way of thinking about the world. And feminist writers have discussed how home can often be a source of oppression and containment for women, actually restricts their lives. It might provide an illusion of stability, but it's actually a source of restriction. And that can be a very difficult process that you know, they have to reevaluate their idea of what home is, what their identity is. It's also very difficult to live as a migrant woman in the cities of northern Thailand that I visited. If they don't have the correct documentation or status, then they often have to avoid the authorities, and it's not the kind of place where they could easily create a sense of belonging. So for many of them, it was a temporary home where they could work on behalf of their communities. But I think that there was still potential there for them to feel a sense of belonging, home, and community, in fact, through their work, through knowing that they would eventually go back home to Myanmar and take the lead on social change in health, in education, in entering women into politics. And it was that vision of the future that gave them the strength to carry on living in what is often a difficult environment. So Nozin says, I like to work here. Sometimes my place is not peaceful. Sometimes I'm scared. Sometimes I'm upset because my education and skills are not enough to work, but I'm proud of myself because when I was younger, I told myself I could not do this kind of work. Living here, I learn, I have friends, I'm happy to work for the Lahu community, So just to summarize what I've hopefully shared with you today, something about the multiple levels at which we can experience home, how adaptable it is, how resilient it is, how we can find new ways to create a sense of belonging in different areas of our life, perhaps even in different parts of the world, and that this has both tangible and intangible elements. So some people feel that their home is rooted in a sense of family, particular places, particular practices, but for other people, home might be found in more than one place. So I'd emphasize that home is an ambiguous, often contested, sometimes area of conflict. But I think it's also possible if the right areas of your life are in place, and I would argue that refugees who are fleeing for their lives right now require a safe passage to a point of safety, because you need that basic safety to be in place before you can actually begin to rebuild your sense of home and contribute to society. But I think once those basic forms of shelter and nourishment are in place, we can perhaps even feel a sense of home in relation to the wider world. Thank you very much.